Purdy,
Here.
Barbara Craig,
Here.
Alan Horowitz,
Here.
Jesse Purden,
Here.
John Jenkins,
Here.
Chris Corey,
Here.
Omar Clark,
Here.
Robert Donaldson, and Russ Wynn.
Here.
Thank you. Before we start, Alan would like to say something.
Yeah, I'm not sure who quite put this discussion item table together, but I wanted to say thanks. This is extremely helpful, at least I found it helpful, and allow us, I think, to progress in a much more reasonable form. So, thanks.
Good. We appreciate
That's
it.
from all of us.
Also, Chairwoman, I just want to let you know, we will have a copy of the charter for you, the current charter, in front of you each meeting as a reference. At the end, we'll collect them, but you'll have them each meeting. So in case for some reason you don't have it with you that day, you'll have them there
Well,
for you.
can we write our name on it so that we can write in it?
Perfectly fine.
You know, otherwise, you know, it's no use if
Correct.
you can't. Thank you. Okay. Approval of the minutes of the meeting of March 11th. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. Now, is this, the discussion of the changes, is that what we have on the blue chart?
Correct. So we've been tracking as you moved along. You originally, prior to your first meeting, you received feedback, and then we've gone through the initial list of those. Now, if you look at the top, you'll see as we go along, any new feedback received, we had Member Purdon provide us some updates of some items to address as new. But as we
Right.
get emails from the public, or if the council reaches out to us, we'll continue to list new ones as new, so you'll know you haven't discussed them yet.
Good, all right. Jess, do you want to discuss the first, since you
Yes, ma'am.
submitted it?
So, let me make sure I'm on the same.
It's the first page, or the four new ones.
Okay, yes. Okay, so the first one pertains to really outreach to the community, and that's being the outreach chair. It really got me thinking that it would be excellent if we could get more participation on city activities, and I feel that it would be more beneficial to people who have to work during the day, and people with families and kids at school and things like that who don't have the ability to come. I think we'd have higher participation if we moved to night meetings.
Don't you think this is one that we should talk with the council in
Absolutely.
regard to?
Oh, absolutely.
When we have our meeting with them. We
Absolutely.
also have a list of those.
We have a list in here, we'll add that to the list.
So,
I don't want a decision on that. I'm just, that's.
no, I think
to
we
be
should
on the list.
talk about it. But I think we should get our ideas on it, and then we should talk to the council. Barbara?
Well, I think I've heard the council speak about this in quite detail at meetings, and the feeling was that there are two groups we're trying to enable to participate effectively in city government. One of them are the senior citizens who tend not to like to come out at night, and in our city there's a large percentage of that. So that I've watched these council discuss this and determine not to do both of them at night, and instead to have one in the morning and one at night. Also, when you do the nighttime meetings, they're almost always like at 5 or 5:30, so they're right at dinner time and when you're dealing with children, so I'm not exactly certain that that actually accomplishes that. But certainly that needs discussion. I think there's some strong feeling on the sides of a number of the people who come, and there are a lot of people who do come who are older who don't like to go out at night, so.
I hear that with all due respect. I think that the difference between not wanting to and not being able to because you're working is completely different. So in order to give people access to the ability and keep it a fair playing ground for everybody, the people who are 40-hour-a-week people who actually have vested interest in the city should still have the capability to come, or at least have their voice heard on whether they would like that or not.
Do we have any statistics about what the attendance is on morning meetings and night meetings? Because we have one of each now.
That would be a
Each
good
month.
thing. I'm open to that. And if I'm completely wrong, I'll take it off. I would love to see the numbers because
Okay,
I'm
I think
all
that's
about
where
that.
to start, because we do have the data we could use from that.
John?
Yeah, since the charter does not address the issue or any requirement there, what you're proposing is that we take that discretion away from the city council, who decides now whether to have a morning or evening meeting and require an evening meeting. Do I understand that correctly?
No, it's not requiring it. It's the potential for it to be voted on as a city. And honestly, if they feel that it's something that they would rather address, our joint meetings are going to be a perfect opportunity for them to look at that on a serious level and say, okay, I see that, and now I'm going to address that, as opposed to it going to the next level, which, I mean, that's the whole purpose of doing the joint meetings with them. So we can wash that out as that moves forward, but this starts the conversation.
But it does, I think, as John's saying, it does make it mandatory where they now have the right to choose one way or the other. You're making it mandatory, if it gets the vote.
Right.
If it
I'm not,
gets to
nobody's making anything mandatory. We're just saying that the people would have the right to decide if they wanted it to or not to be mandatory.
Correct. Okay.
Are
Yes.
we referring to the city council, the one for the 9 o'clock and the one for the 5:30? Or all meetings that related to the city? Are we just, or,
I would be open. I mean, if we wanted to work out a staggered pattern where it was every third meeting or something was a day meeting, I'm open to anything along those lines. My whole objective is to ensure that other people who I know would be interested in what's going on have the ability to do that, and that's it. There's no agenda behind that other than
Right.
furthering our agenda and getting more participation.
All
My
right,
wife-
well, oh,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry, Russ, go
my
right
wife
ahead.
and I, we own Noah's Ark Academy. We just recently sold that. Had over 110 kids a day in that academy. A lot of working families, I'm just talking working families now. They come in, 6 o'clock is when we close. So there is a I see our area growing with working families. A waiting list now on the childcare. In every childcare in this area, there's a waiting list. So the population is growing, working families, and you can see that as being in the childcare. You see how they're rushing around getting the kids at 4, picking them up at 5, and if they wanted to participate in something like this, it can be a little challenging, versus somebody that's retired and have a little more time. I'm just throwing that out, just from my experience.
All right, we will put that on
Yeah.
the agenda for the joint meeting. Next.
Tightening up term limit language just to make sure it's good to go. Obviously, it was copied and pasted from my email. So,
Yes.
But on that, I was speaking to the mayor, and we were just discussing when we were initially looking at how the language was going to be written on the ballot amendment that did this. We wanted to be sure that it was airtight after this process was done, because if we missed anything or there was anything that had not yet happened, we want to just make sure it's cleaned up as much as it can be, and there's absolute clarity moving forward. And this is a process by which we could do that. So I would defer to the county or to the city attorney on that. And if you think there is anything that needs to, excellent. If you think we're good to go as it went, then that's fine too.
So let me give you a little background on that. I think this comment came up in the council discussions, and I think some of our prior discussions. The issue of what was voted on in 2010 and other elections about the term limits. Now, up until just prior to 2000 election, the city had its election every spring, same dates, from year to year, as did most cities have it staggered. Then powers that be at the legislature decided that, well, wouldn't everybody save money if we did everything during the presidential preference primaries? And because there were charter provisions to prevent that from occurring, they created an out. And they said basically you can move, just notwithstanding any charter provision, that any city can move its election to the presidential preference primary. This is back in, I think the first change happened in '99. And then subsequent elections and intent, I suspect in order to increase voter participation or certain voters' participation, they kept moving that around with subsequent changes to the state law. And ultimately, what ended up happening is, between this most recent change and what allowed the council to move their vote, move their terms out the additional 8 months, was that, and I think it was, I want to say it was the 2010 referendum change, was to just allow, through the charter, the movement of the election date to go correspond to any state, local, or other election. Well, at the time, that was still always discussing the primaries that occurred in the spring. So I don't believe the thought could have been, back when that referendum approved, that it would be going to the fall, because that wasn't still allowed yet by state law. State law subsequently amended, so I think the, Mr. Purdon, the problem we have is that that can still change. And so what I've told the city council is 4 years is 4 years. And 4 years and 11 months is still 4 years, as I tell my toddler is, but once it gets to 5 years, that's the hard limit. Now, how do we adjust it otherwise? It can't be shortened below 4 years, and we couldn't tie it to a term of months without causing problems with what the other intent is, which is to be flexible on that election date. So it's a language created problem. Can we come up with the language that really tries to tighten it up, and then can we restrain the legislature from changing things or even mandating changes in the future? And I don't know the answer to those questions.
But, excuse me, it's just
Arlene?
also, I think you were looking at the actual language we passed the last time regarding the number of years each one could reserve, and that language making sure that repeat applicants.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was keeping the retreads out.
Okay, I wasn't, because it was just so clear, I thought we were talking about just the,
But
The
no,
number of
that is
terms.
good. No, that had to happen. So,
So are we saying that if somebody served 2 full terms, 4 and 4,
yep.
that they're not able to run again? Is that what we're trying to do?
Now they can have, they have the option for upward mobility to
They-
run for mayor,
Okay,
but other than
no,
that,
no
they're-
longer,
Well, before how it was, they could sit 2 years out and then they could come right
Yeah.
back on.
so we're gonna try to eliminate that.
It's 2 years.
Okay.
Now, if they take over, I think the way it's written, correct me if I'm wrong, Arlene, is that if you take over a term, for example,
Right,
That
those two
doesn't
don't
count.
apply. Right,
Okay.
Exactly.
Unless you took over more than
Unless you
24
took
months.
More than 2 years in.
Yeah.
2 years, exactly.
And I think that that's a very creative solution for the 11 months to,
Mhm.
for the 5 year without recreating the wheel. That,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a smart way to
Mhm.
do it, I think, in my opinion, honestly. So I don't know where that leaves that, but now that everybody can hear my full process and thought on that.
I think when we get to the end, what we're probably gonna end up with is a complete strike through and underline of the whole charter. And at that point, when everyone can review everything in context, maybe then language will seem to make better sense. But I think the language we have now
Is good,
is,
right,
is good,
yes.
encapsulated.
Third,
And then third is zero political advocacy from city employees and city races. And that's, I mean, that's self-explanatory. I don't have to get into real-life examples, but we had 2 last election cycle. So, I mean, it's not a problem that's going to be a game changer, but just the appearance should not be
what's the
there.
problem? Give us the problem.
If say for example, a city manager decided to be on a flyer for somebody who was running for mayor, hypothetically, that would be a conflict that I'm saying would not be allowed. Because if the perception that the person who's the city manager is behind your candidacy for mayor, is you're carrying the perception of the weight of the city with you, and that's not appropriate.
All right, now you're the city manager,
Right.
and you're not on the picture,
Right.
but you're out, and somebody says, "Who are you for?" and you say, "The mayor."
Yeah, you just say the mayor. You can say them. No, they shouldn't say. I don't believe that they should be politically active. They can be in the state house races. They can be in the county house. But as far as city council itself goes, the people who are going to be their direct boss, their ties should not be politically there. They should. They just.
That's almost impossible.
It's not impossible. All you have to do is say, as a city employee, you can't be involved in actively campaigning for somebody running for city office.
and at this time you can.
And at this time, I believe, my understanding is that you can.
You can say who you're for. But you're saying you can't now. I mean, under your provision.
I want to say the rule is they're not supposed to now.
Yeah.
There are a couple overlapping rules, and I'll just say, for the committee's benefit, this is an issue that a lot of cities try to deal with. The state election code already prohibits
That's a hatch act.
influence, influence upon your employees, employee time being dedicated
Right.
towards candidates. You also have, we have our own our personnel policies that are intended to shield the staff from any influence from the council. Now, what that, in practical terms, means we try to avoid the council, maybe you have a director level position, a director of public works or some other large department, who happens to personally own a house that's at a great corner for yard signs. And they get asked by the council person in their district, could I put signs in your yard? This is where the law right now doesn't really apply, but there feels that undue influence, or the undue influence to possibly give a contribution, especially at the higher level positions. It's really difficult to draft something. I mean, the election code and our own personnel codes are supposed to protect the employees from that kind of influence. But you also have to balance that against the rights of employees who may live in the city to be politically active in the races that interest them. So I think we'd have to come up, we maybe have to send out the materials we have. I can send out some of the provisions in the election code, and maybe we can see if there's anything that we're missing that we want to try and address.
And I'm not saying they can't stuff envelopes in their free time. I'm saying from a city office, I wouldn't want Arlene to be in the city office working on mailers for the mayor's race.
Well,
via-
that's
you know what I mean?
prohibited, I think, now.
Right, but last election cycle, that wasn't the case. There were violations of that were inappropriate. So what I'm saying is, if we bring it up, it won't happen again. And that's the only way we can do it.
And may I just?
Barbara?
I think there's a theoretical point behind that that's important too. We're supposed to have staff that works for the people, that works for the city, not for the individual member of the council. So that's one piece of it. And the other is that they're supposed to be chosen based on their professional credentials and experience, and that they're not supposed to be chosen based on, you're my political friend. And one of the ways to protect against that is to prevent that from showing. Nationally, that's called the Hatch Act, and you can't participate as a national bureaucrat in political activities. And I don't know enough about the state level to know if that's here too, but there are really good reasons both to protect the staff from being pressured into doing that, and also to protect the council and prevent them from choosing friends rather than expert staff. And so I think there's a reason to do that. I wasn't aware it wasn't required, so I'm
John?
a bit surprised by that.
Well, when you get into these issues, I mean, from my perspective, it's one thing to talk about the city manager, but you have a whole staff out there who have First Amendment rights and can say and do things that they want to do in the course of an election and otherwise. So I think it's kind of a slippery slope when you start talking about this circumstance and that circumstance. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing if there are some specific circumstances in the context of the statute and some of the rules that you mentioned, and I didn't do that much homework. I didn't look these up to see what they said, but if you could distribute that.
Sure, we
And if
can.
there are some specific
No,
examples
there are. and
that
I'm-
you have in mind.
I know that the county
but
manager and I
I'd
don't know
be-
if the county attorney, they're
hang on.
aware of them. And
Okay,
they
hang-
happened last cycle.
Okay, well, then I'd like to hear those specifically, but in terms of this sort of wholesale
Right.
statement that, zero political advocacy from city employees, I don't see that at all. And so I think that's the context. We also have to consider this, not just specific examples that have come up that some people think are problematic.
And it can be it doesn't have to be as strongly worded as zero political advocacy. I was trying to be expedient and so that everybody could see my point. It can be limited to the city of Naples races if
So people
not
can even
limiting
spring
them from
Well,
county, state.
it's
or
all right
federal
if it's
races.
limited to the city of Naples.
Or, I'm sorry.
let's put it in our charter.
The city of Bonita Springs, and I'm all about the First Amendment, so I understand where you're coming from, and if we wanted to limit it to the county attorney, the city manager, and a handful of others, fine. I mean, I just want to think, fundamentally, it's not right that they would be using their position and/or being on city time in any capacity, working on city races, when those people are going to be working for them. That's not right.
Well, let me give you, I'll give you an example that works the opposite way. I've seen this issue come up from bottom-up politics. Maybe 10 years ago or so, I had an issue with a county building official who drove around in his personal truck with a giant, almost billboard size sign for a candidate running against the existing incumbent commissioner. But when the problem came up it was the code enforcement staff saying, well, we want to go after this person for having an illegal sign. He just happens to be the department head over us. So it had nothing to do with the existing commission, but the issue is almost coming up from the rights of the employee engaging in something that was a job conflict for him. I think that we'll circulate the local appropriate documents. Another thing to consider is this sort of goes along to one of the last items and probably some of the items I'm going to bring up in the future. For the joint session, we may get to an area where we have a bucket of amendments to the charter, a bucket of items that could go in the charter, but you'd like the city council to consider possibly adopting as ordinances or regulations, and maybe even things such as non-binding referendum items, like whether the meetings are held in the morning or the afternoon. Not tying the city council, but also maybe if we have the opportunity to put it out to voters to let them, to get some of their thoughts on it. So I'm just thinking about where we've been going with some of these questions. I don't want to close any of the discussions, but I'm saying if we're going to be passing those items on to the council, maybe they should come with recommendations as to where they could go, so that they don't just get pushed out of hand either.
Good, good.
I think it will be helpful for you to see our personnel manual as well, that goes through each of these times and.
Yes, that would be very good.
Number 4?
Okay, number 4.
Number 4, 12-hour notice on special meetings, changed to 48 business hours, i.e. weekend hours cannot be included on the notice. And just so I'm not speaking in generalities, I'll cut to exactly why I made this rule.
Right.
When they were discussing medicinal marijuana dispensaries in the city, they decided at 3 o'clock on a Friday that they were going to have a meeting on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, and they said that that was sufficient notice. I was there and I was part of getting that decision changed, but if I was not and others were not, that would have flown completely under the radar, and that was a huge deal. So in the spirit of keeping the community part of the process, I would move that we go from 12 hours to 48 business hours so people have an appropriate time to respond. This is going to give nobody an advantage, but it's going to be the right thing to do as far as transparency goes for the people of Bonita.
Yeah, would that be a charter amendment, or
I think so.
wouldn't it be
I think so.
something they would adopt?
I think it could be done either way. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It could be done as an administrative code ordinance or a charter review, but the one thing that Member Purd and I talked about when he provided the comments is we would want you to consider exceptions for emergency management for reasons when we needed to call
Oh,
a
yeah.
special meeting because of a
Hurricane.
pending hurricane, storm, or other such emergency situation.
And obviously, hurricanes, the issues of safety, 100% I agree. But things as important as the Land Development Code has. 3 o'clock on Friday, hey, we have a meeting at 8. No, that's fine because we have notice. That's not right.
Well, I'll just point out, there are statutory procedures for adoption of land development regulations, and there's a specific prohibition against emergency ordinances for land development regulations. I do recall a little bit of the conversation at the time with Ms. Vance about what was going on. I suspect that meeting would have led to the initiation of an ordinance, but it still would have had to go through multiple public hearings. So there would have been further notice. So, and that also goes back to the question of when the meetings are in the morning or in the afternoon. For land development regulations or other regulations, there is a requirement unless the council actually votes to change the time otherwise. There's a morning meeting requirement and at least one evening meeting requirement. Now, because of the way our meetings flip, we almost always have at least one of those meetings in the morning and one in the afternoon. It's conceivable that we could have a first reading and then another meeting that didn't come after 5:30, but just, there are certain things that always have to be split up and without further action, but when we get back into the discussion about timing, that would
Right, but
be
the
something to consider.
logistics of whether it happens or not are dependent on the vote. So if what you're trying to do is via the public motivate an appropriate response to get action from the council, regardless of the fact that it's gonna get punted in a month, doesn't matter if you don't have the vote. So that's why I'm saying the 48 hours is what matters, because that gives people, regardless of whatever the issue is, I don't even have one in mind, the ability to properly get together, coordinate, and come and see their council folks and let them know what they feel about it. And it'll be enough time for it to generate in the atmosphere through social media, through the newspaper, things like that. It will, instead of just a Friday 4 o'clock email that goes out to a handful of people, and then at 8 o'clock in the morning, we're talking about something that affects all of us. Just not right.
Chair.
John?
Could we get some specific language on that? I understand what you're saying, Jesse, and I actually remember that incident with the marijuana dispensaries. To me, 48 business hours is, 8 business hours a day, so that's like a whole week's worth. So I think the concept, I understand, maybe you could work with staff and come up with specific charter
What do you mean 48
language.
business? I just mean 2 days. I mean 2 days.
Right.
He's
Right.
not doing 5-8 ones, he's doing 48 contiguous.
I get it.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
that's, to
city
me, that's,
business.
hmm?
16 business hours is, I
Right.
think, what you actually meant.
Okay, 16
Yeah.
business
So-
hours.
Yeah.
Bottom line, I would like the public to have 2 days that are not over the
Yeah.
weekend to respond. So however the language looks, that's what I would shoot.
Probably
And I would
easier
like
to
to
just
look
call
at the
it-
language to
Yeah.
get a sense of what we're talking about
Probably
here.
just easier to call it 2 business days.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and I'm open to a complete discussion on that. I'm just saying I think it's fair. And honestly, neither side benefits from it. The only people who benefit are the citizens, because they'll get a chance to respond. That's all I have.
Okay. Now, I don't know how we want to go down this list. Or could you recommend?
So the rest of these items, you've visited and you said you're gonna have continued discussion on, and as you get further along, you'll see you've got completed discussion on. And some of them we've
I see
already
that.
identified as, add to, so the ones we've talked about today that we're gonna add to the city council agenda meetings, we'll continue to do that. You've had one go around on each of these, so I think you could move through the rest of your agenda.
Through the rest now.
And then as these topics continue to percolate, we can revisit and determine whether you want to proceed further, have more information.
I was wondering if maybe we shouldn't have the attorney speak
Yeah, I would have jumped in anyway.
prior to doing all this, because he's done some work on this.
Well, and I provide you 3 attachments for today's agenda, going back to prior discussion meetings, and then obviously I also dumped a lot of stuff on you at the last meeting. I apologize when these got sent out. They sent them in the form that makes it easy to read, but it cut off the section number, so I want to give you for the record what those
All right.
statutory sections are. The first one, this comes from chapter 163. It's 163.3167, and that is the Florida Growth Management Act. It's basically just the scoping section saying this is what cities and counties are allowed to do. And in there, subsection 8, there is a prohibition that was put in a few years ago on municipal referendums or initiative proceedings for anything related to land development regulations, comprehensive plans, or specific development orders. And this sort of goes a little bit back to Ms. Craig's discussion on the height. I did end up speaking with Bob Britt, the former city attorney at Naples, and I asked him about what his thoughts are on the height limitations that are in their charter. And he told me that he felt that that was a grandfather clause. It was no longer applicable. I don't know that I read it the same way. I do understand the logic he was citing, and I believe it could be, let me put it this way, I believe it would be challenged by someone based on this statutory language. What this language does in subsection 8 is effectively preempt to the state without saying it. It says these areas are not something you're to hold referendums or charter amendments on. And that means certain land development issues. And so if we were to put a prohibition on height or some kind of fixed regulation into our charter, that is what he believed, and I would agree that there would be challenges to any attempt to do so. I don't know that I read the language as limiting that you couldn't have, say, supermajority votes and some of the other things we've talked about, but I just wanted you to have the information so you could look at that language.
What would be the basis of the challenge?
I
That
beg
it's
your
preempted
pardon,
to this-
Barbara, could you say that again?
What would be the basis of the challenge?
That it's specifically prohibited. All land development regulations stem from, at some level, Chapter 163, and if the scope of the act says you're not to consider anything by referendum or initiatives, and they've used the language broadly on one end, saying comprehensive plans, down to development orders, which is actually a statutorily defined term, which would be anything, any kind of building permit of any kind. I believe that you could make an argument that there's at least a passive preemption on that issue. I think that, I believe I could parse that language out to allow some kind of provision to be put in the charter, but I just wanted to get you that information. There certainly does not prohibit any sort of limitation in the land development regulations on height or anything else.
Right.
What this
But-
is saying
but
is,
just in the
you're
charter.
not putting your land development regulations out for a vote of the people. And if you happen to put one out there that has a height limitation, for instance, that may be crossed with this statutory guidance. So I haven't looked at the backup. The language really stands for itself. The second statute I provide you for your consideration is, we talked at one point about, actually it was at the last meeting, about the ex parte communication rules and the history of that. We do have an ex parte communication ordinance. This was actually the legal authority for that, and what that basically states is, whenever you have a quasi-judicial item go before the council, there is no prejudice, at least there is no default position of prejudice against or for the applicant if they've made disclosures as to ex parte communications on the record, site visits, or independent research. The presumption previously in a case called Jennings v. Dade County, I believe, had been that someone found out after a vote on zoning had occurred that some of the council members had had communications with the applicant. And so if you were opposing that project, you would have been, you were entitled to a unbiased fact finder at the hearing, and there could have been prejudice. So what case law said at that point is, the burden then shifts to the applicant to sustain the case, otherwise it's presumed that there was a prejudice. Now, the legislature came back after a lot of debate, because there were a significant number of people saying, well, wait a minute. These are my elected officials, whether you're the applicant or someone opposing, I have a right to petition them and to speak with them. And if I can't do that, legislature punted by saying, okay, we'll leave it to the local governments to remove the presumption, but you have to establish this process. And this is a process that we have here in Bonita Springs. It basically says that at some point, written or orally, before a final vote is taken, you have to disclose those communications, the nature of those communications. It includes things such as reading out, a citizen's petition that had 100 neighbors' signatures on it. I know we spoke at the last meeting, I take it, and I'm going to be working with the council on this, I believe even staff communications runs the risk of prejudice if you do not disclose it. So I just want to provide, that was something I promised you at the last meeting.
What's the reference to this statute?
This is 286.0115. And you actually, if you.
Could you,
say that
I'm
again?
sorry, could you say it again?
286.0115. And I'll say this because it may actually be something if any of the members feel they want to do some independent research. Chapter 286 is the miscellaneous public business chapter. There's actually quite a bit of interesting statutory like placeholders in there, if anyone just wants to read for their own edification.
Wait, could you also repeat the previous one, 163, with subsection 8?
163, 3167.
And you said that we follow this now
We do.
in Bonita Springs.
Yeah, the section in our code is, section 4-30. It's only a couple of paragraphs long, but basically it's just either read aloud or file a form ahead of the meeting so that anyone could find out the nature of those disclosures.
It is, may I just make a comment on that?
Yes.
Since I sit on the zoning board and watch this,
Good, yes.
is that it's not very clear exactly what it is you have to state in clarifying that you've had ex-parte contacts. And it seems to me therein lies the problem. You can say, I met with so-and-so, but if you don't know what the contents of that meeting are, it's not a very effective disclosure to the other side, whichever is the other side, of what may have transpired and influenced the vote. And when you're doing a quasi-judicial hearing, this is the problem of having your basically legislative body be everything, executive, legislative, and judicial. Because yes, you have a right to contact your elected official when they're acting in a legislative mode, but there's a question when they're acting in a judicial mode, whether that's the case. And I think that one of the things I think I mentioned last time that we did in the zoning board is to agree among us that we would not meet with parties who are coming before us on either side. We would let that be in the open so that everyone would know what was transpired. And at the workshop between the zoning board and the council about a year ago, I think it is now, that was quite a question of long discussion. And what a compromise position was attempted to be reached, rather than outlawing completely any meetings, was to say that a member of the council could meet with somebody, but they must have a staff member present, so there would be a witness to what was transpiring there. And
Did they have to say what was what happened?
but they didn't, and they didn't have to, and they didn't agree to that, by the way. That
Oh.
was something that was discussed and not agreed to. So we're in a position now in that what I see is, oh, I met with Joe, or I talked with a neighbor. And you don't even necessarily know who the neighbor is, and you have the clue what the discussion might have been about. To the extent that you want to pretend, and I think all we're doing is pretending, that you have a quasi-judicial hearing, that you have actually a hearing in which all the evidence is presented at the hearing and the decision is made based on that. We don't really have it. And that's, I mean, it troubles me, but I don't know if you have a council that is unwilling to move in that direction. I don't know what you do. There are places, in fact, I believe our county government doesn't allow any communication when they're acting in a quasi-judicial way. And that's the thing that's, I think, so hard to clarify to citizens, that you say, they're my elected officials, I have a right to talk to them. And when they're acting like your elected officials, yeah, you do, absolutely. But if you're going to try to have that same body act like a quasi-judicial body rather than having a formal hearing what do they call it, advisor?
Hearing examiner.
Examiner, I knew
whatever.
there was a word there I wasn't getting out. That sort of gets around that kind of problems, and so then when it's presented, the whole case is presented to the council with the recommendation of the hearing examiner. And in fact, that is what our documents are based on. We took almost verbatim stuff out of the Lee County charter or rules and stuck them in our place, but we didn't include the hearing examiner.
Well, and honestly, I've been doing this long enough that I can see a lot of different sides on that. The county commission almost never acts in a quasi-judicial manner, because even the way they've set it up with over the years, the hearing examiner hears cases in extreme detail. And then only an appeal from the hearing examiner can go to the county commission based on the record prior. So what ends up happening is sometimes the public shows up at the commission meeting or someone else, and No one can talk to them because the record is basically
And that was
limited.
true in here until they made that change
And
at the council.
is this televised? No, I'm not gonna say what I think about it. But, about other communities. But I think what I've heard from numerous cities is it's very difficult to explain when you don't have the process of a hearing examiner. And in Collier County, for instance, their hearing examiner, he does meet with people, and he doesn't disclose it all the time.
I'm sorry,
Their
Ken.
hearing examiner does meet with people, does meet with the applicant, does meet with lots of parties, and I've raised.
Individually without all of them.
Individually,
in
and
the-
I've
yeah.
raised that issue on issues I've had down there. But the situation comes, you know, for instance, Ms. Craig, you're in the zoning board. Well, you might not be as recognizable to people in the general public as a council person. They run into a Publix, and they want to talk to them about the big project down the street from them. And although the discussion may be, I'm not opposed to those kind of things. And do you know what pickleball does? It drives me crazy when they play all night long. And so the comments may be from council members and their disclosures. Yeah, I spoke with several citizens because they grab them on the street. They're constituents. They don't have. It's very difficult for them in those tight quarters to explain to them the intricacies of quasi-judicial proceedings and say, I can't talk to you about this. It just seems like they're being rude. So that's part of, I've heard rationale given for why they don't want to do that. Now, on another side of it, sometimes the opposition or the applicants, they don't feel that the opportunity is granted at a public hearing, particularly the opposition doesn't feel the opportunity is granted at a public hearing to go into excruciating detail. So they want to have those one-on-one times with the quasi-judicial board members so they can go over plans and go into great detail. Now, we have encouraged our council to be as detailed as possible. And even though they haven't adopted a rule of not having communications, it has been the policy, at least since I've been here, that if any of them meet with applicants or parties related to quasi-judicial proceeding, staff has been there. And usually either I or Carly has been in every one of those meetings. Not so much for the quasi-judicial part, but because we've had so many claims where people said things were said in meetings that we can't substantiate. We're trying to protect the interests of the city and the council members themselves from having their comments,
Well, of course,
in
the
one
coun-
way being twisted against them.
Of course, the council member can't speak individually with any authority at all. So if
No.
he's made some statement in an individual meeting, that carries zip.
And that ultimately, that's one of the issues that came out of that original case and the Jennings case is there's the presumption, but that presumption is rebuttable. And in lawsuits fighting the validity of an action taken on a zoning matter, the courts will not look into the collective decision-making process. If they found that there's one member who has possible violation, they may allow that person to be deposed and to try and figure out, what did you think? But if they made a motion on grounds that were based on evidence at the proceeding, then there is some privilege there, and it's presumed that the council acting collectively were voting on those items, unless obviously each of them had been spoken with, then there's a possibility.
I
for
think we
representation.
have to move on, or we'll be on this subject for an hour and a half. John?
I'd like to get a sense, because right now, makes up a big group of the items on our list. And when I look at Section 56 of the charter, it's very simple and clean and simply makes reference to the standards of conduct in Chapter 112. And I'm not that as close to this issue as some here, but I see this is got a lot of meat to it, and there are people with a lot of feelings about how some of these issues should be addressed. And it sounds like there have been a number of policies and both written and unwritten that have guided what goes on with some of the committees and the council itself. I'm just wondering what we as a group should be considering in terms of a change to Section 56, if anything, or whether these are a number of issues that should continue to be addressed somewhere other than within this code section.
Can you wait while we find Section 56?
And
Page
if we are talking about addressing these,
36.
I'd like to know, I'm sorry, you said wait, I'll let you take a look.
No, that's all right.
Are we looking at page 36 in this right here,
Yeah.
where it says Code of Ethics?
Mhm.
Is that what we're referring to, what you're
Yes. I mean, at least in our little summary, which, and I echo Alan's appreciation for pulling that together, you know, there are a number of these items that are all considered at section 56.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Well,
I think, let me just address
Yes.
some of this.
Yes, you can speak.
I think this whole section is very problematic. I think we have examples of council members advocating for certain development projects, and then at the last minute recusing themselves from the vote. I don't think that's right. I think if you're going to advocate for a particular project, then you need to be quiet during council meetings, and you should not be in a position to vote. I also think if you're taking contributions from those developers, that needs to be disclosed. I'm not so much worried about the applicants. I think whatever the applicants can do to push forth their agenda is fine. What I'm concerned about is the quasi-judicial officers that are making the final decisions acting inappropriately. And that's why I'm the one that probably wrote most of these questions on 56, and I think it's very lacking in terms of the charter as to what the rules ought to be. There's a number of instances along Old 41 in downtown Bonita Springs where certain council people have advocated on behalf of certain developers, and then either voted or they recused themselves from voting. But I think it's just basically unfair that developers can seize an opportunity with one council person and think they have an inside track in terms of that person's ability to influence council decisions. So I think if that's what you're trying to do, then you ought to be an advocate and not be part of the actual proceedings. Or if you're taking money, then you ought to disclose it.
How do we, and that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing a lot of different opinions on this topic. How do we as a committee get to a point where we do go one way or the other on some of these items? Is it a wholesale rewrite of this section with a lot of the detail and you know, who's going to do, I mean, does there need to be direction to staff or some other way in which that content that's developed? Or are we then going to, I would assume there would be a lot of input on that particular topic in terms of the committee's action, and that may be fine, that may be something we need to dive into, but I think that's kind of the question in my mind is we've got two extremes here. We have a very simple charter provision right now, and what I'm seeing and hearing are a whole lot of other issues that some would like to see addressed here, and that may be the direction we need to take, but how do we determine where we're going?
It would seem that maybe we should get all the provisions that would go into this section, you know, would be this section, and then have just a meeting on all those provisions. And write, if we have to, write a new section 56. You know, if we have a lot of different people and a lot of things on the list that affect section 56, I think it's something that where we should grab all those things together. If you wrote a lot of things that you saw were against 56 or that could be
Fleshed out,
enumerated,
yeah.
I think then we should have them all together and just discuss those.
Well, I just want to point out, I did.
Barbara, do you want to talk?
Well, I'm waiting to see when somebody's ready. Yes, I do think, because I think what we need to keep in mind here is it's not just what we think we need to change, but what we can adequately explain to the public as reasons for why we want to change them so they can understand whether to vote yes or no. And some of these things are pretty complicated to explain for that. So that I think needs to be another one of the pieces that we consider.
That's
well,
why
but
we
do
have to discuss them all
And I
together.
think together, and just figure which ones could we actually make a case for or against, or, you know, this is the reason we are putting this forward. Do you want this or this? And I think that's our position, at least at the start, to say, this would accomplish this goal, and we think that's important because. And if we can't do that, we're not going to have successful
Correct.
things go forward, basically.
Jesse, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think that there should be some type of summary, as you're alluding to, brought together with all of these so we can thoroughly vet them. But I don't think we need a separate meeting for us prior to meeting with council, because maybe these are going to be points that the council is going to want to run with. And I think to simply replace 56 with all of this stuff is
No,
it's-
no, I'm
it's-
not saying replace 56. We have to see what applies to 56 and if it is
Right.
covered by
Right.
this.
But we're talking.
But
about
we're not
potentially-
going to
right.
discuss it with the council before we discuss it with us.
Right, but what are you trying to? Are we trying to fundamentally rewrite this code and replace
No,
it
we're
with-
trying to find out what we're looking at. How many things that are in this list,
Right,
and it's a rather long list,
right.
affects this particular section.
And I would specifically enjoy having some, as I was asked by John earlier, for examples to quantify the reasons that I'd like exact examples to what you're referring to and alluding to in regards to
Yeah, I would
specific
too.
councilmen, specific projects, where these all this stuff. If this is a real thing, I'm concerned in the highest level, and I would like to know what they are. So if you could bring those forward, I'd appreciate it.
No, absolutely.
John?
I'm not sure I agree with that last comment. I mean, if we start getting into,
We're
I
not
think we
going to
can
get
deal
into
more in the abstract.
personalities, I can assure you
It's
of
not
that.
about personality.
No,
Well,
but
not
it's making
personalities, but-
We're
accusations
not
without
going to
them
get
here. I don't think
into
that's fair.
that,
Excuse me. I think we're
not
just-
in a public meeting,
So we're
with
just-
no one discussing on the other
So we're going to
side.
simply say that councilmen are taking bribes and then
No,
not
we are
quantify
not
it?
saying that.
That's essentially what that whole section says.
Well, let me, can maybe, I'm looking at page 3 of the chart. I think that's really covers the bulk of the 56 items, and I believe, I don't believe that Mr. Corey's comments are all necessarily targeted to, or Ms. Craig's comments are all strictly targeted to 56 in what it already covers. It's just that seems like the logical place to start with ethical issues is what's there. So at the last meeting, I provided you all with summaries of what the Code of Ethics for Florida has. And for these examples, I don't believe that anything in that will actually cover the concerns. But the way I kind of look at these are, and I know we talked about a lot about the contribution issues, and I'll get to that in the next item that I attached. But if we are, I can sort of, I think I'm summarizing these comments by saying, okay, we have the quasi-judicial ex parte communication rule. Then we have a disclosure of contributions related to applications, okay? And as we did discuss at the last meeting, that those contributions are all disclosed in the financial reports given to supervisor election, but that would require someone to do independent research. So whether or not that should be disclosed as part of the package that goes before the council, or we just acknowledge it's already disclosed in one manner. I mean, so I think that's the practical issue we're dealing with. It's a practical concern, not whether or not they are disclosed. They are disclosed, you just might not know where they are. But I think the problem becomes, which is, what is the remedy? So for the example that Mr. Corey gave is, what if you have a council member, or it could apply down to lower level boards like the zoning board. What if you have a member who is interested in a project, involved in a project, maybe lives in that neighborhood and has expressed concerns about a project or in favor of a project, and maybe doesn't have a technical conflict because they're not actually getting paid by it, but maybe because they have received a contribution or something and they recuse themselves from the vote. Well, I think that's ultimately all we can ask them to do.
Right.
Now, to go back to Mr. Corey's point, they're not required, unless they're getting under this section 56, which is exacerbatingly detailed in the state statute, whether they have a special private gain, whether it's nepotism, whether they are actually, they have more than 5% owner in a company, if it's a publicly traded company, et cetera, whether those rules have actually been tripped where they're required to step out of a vote. This seems to be more of a voluntary issue. So it could be up for consideration by the Charter Review Committee to consider whether or not, if there has been a campaign contribution, whether they should require that they step out of the vote. That's the difference between what is and what could be. Now, I guess I'm just off the top of my head, there could be all sorts of issues with that too, because then what happens when people are opposed to a project and you get neighborhoods who contributed, but they contributed months before they even knew an issue was coming up. I mean, I'm just putting that out there for things to think about, because I think what Mr. Jenkins is trying to do is try to figure out, well, what do we do with these concerns? And so I'm just sort of laying the groundwork of what you could do and what maybe you have the power to consider.
Well, I think by putting them together, we see whether we're even involved in doing anything about that particular issue. It's not that we're going to decide that everything that is on this list is something that we should do. I think we have to look at the whole picture. And it seems to me, I'm not saying we have a private meeting. I'm just saying that at the meeting, we bunch the ones together and have the discussion on that, and then we go to the next group. Otherwise, we're going to be having this back and forth through about 10 at least issues on this thing that we could get bunched together, have the discussion, and then go on with the next subject. I'm not saying have a private meeting.
I wasn't indicating that you were. I was just saying that I feel it was appropriate for us to be able to kind of view this similar to how we have all of these things together in one format now. We could look at all of the potential suggestions for 56 in a more condensed format so that we can appropriately decide what each one of these individual points means, and I don't think it requires a special meeting, and
No, that's what I'm saying, that we do. That we condense these
Right.
that are in regard to section 56.
Right.
And discuss those.
Yeah.
And then go on to the next subject. That's what I'm saying.
I absolutely agree with that.
Okay,
Next case.
move on.
Can you do that for
Yeah,
us?
and what we'll do is, we'll go back and we'll put it on the agenda for the next meeting, but I'll go back and talk to Mr. Corey, and I'll look at and see if any of the other comments from anyone else, and see if I can clarify them maybe, and rephrase the language so that it's maybe like, should we do
And
this?
Arlene, I think, knows who put what
Yeah.
thing in. And if you could talk to them and get their ideas, that really is a very good suggestion you made.
We could place an agenda item that addresses this
Section
section on its
56.
own. Yes.
Can I ask another question on that?
Yes?
Is there a way that you can give us an idea of what a referendum language would look like to accomplish some of the things we want? My brain is not wrapping around how we get from the idea, these are things that need to be done, and this is how we would present it to the public. So at
Well, you
least-
don't want to write language until you know what you're doing. And it's not hard. Once we
Yeah, I
get
don't
the
think
things
it's hard.
down, it's not hard to write the language.
I think what we might want to do is create a list of bullet points of items that we want to be wrapped around the specific language
Right.
that would
Okay.
end. And I think that that point, once we have discussed the bullet points, then our city attorney can draft it appropriately in the correct legal
Right.
language
That
to then
makes
be
sense.
reviewed. And it's also
Correct.
something, once you have your bullet points, you could take that to your joint meeting with the council so they understand the concepts of of what you're trying to accomplish with
Correct.
the correct
I think
with the
that's a good
changes.
idea.
I agree.
Good.
That's good.
All right.
Okay,
Now,
the other-
is there another subject on here that
Well,
is not?
I did provide you an attachment of the
Yes.
the contributions. That was, you
Yes,
guys
you
asked to
did.
look into that, so, almost everybody meets what the current statutory guidance is, which is anything county-wise or less, the limit is 1,000. It used to be 500. So a few cities keep the 500. Interestingly, it seems that there was a trend in Sarasota County for the cities there to all go very low.
Yeah.
It's 200 and 250. I think I went back and looked at the dates that they enacted these things, and I think there was almost a competition, a race to the bottom to see how low they could get the contributions.
Prove that we're saving your money, huh?
But fairly everybody else either doesn't have a provision at all, and almost nobody had it in their charters. So almost all this was done by ordinance, or they left it blank, which if they left it blank, it defaulted to the state rules.
Thank you. Now, do you want to discuss other items that are on this list that are not done, that have nothing to do with section 56?
And for 56 cents.
Yeah, I had one item just to get back to, and that was just, I think it's an easy one, so why don't we try tackling that? It
Good.
was the transitional items. I mean,
Good.
we agreed that to take the one section out, that was kind of one of the done items or completed. And then you mentioned at a prior meeting that, in fact, there had been a referendum that authorized the city council to, I think that's how you characterize it,
Yes.
that it was, that had the authority to take out transitional items.
Correct. I believe it's the very first charter review. did that.
So, to my way of thinking, then, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to put that back out again to the public, but rather, if we, as a committee, feel like the council ought to take action and in fact remove those transitional sections from the charter, maybe we ought to let them know that, and they would have then our input on that and have a basis to move forward, since the people, in a sense, have already spoken on
Right.
it.
That's good.
So-
That's a good
so
idea.
That was our next agenda item. We did
Yeah.
include the transitional
Yeah.
sections, each section of the charter that was identified as transitional. And if you look at section 76, it says elimination of transition elements from the charter. Upon completion of the transition phase, in certain, herein, those sections of the charter relating to transition may be eliminated from the charter by city council by adoption of a regular ordinance. So I know you actually voted for section 7, but there's several other sections that are transitional
But
items.
I think we wouldn't have to
Correct.
put that in, and we could put in all of these items into just a memo to them that we feel that they have the right, and we feel it would be appropriate to take out the transition items as shown in our memo. Is that all right with you, John?
Yeah, I don't know which bucket that falls in, under Mr. Rooney's buckets there, but yeah, I think that'd be the way to go.
Do the second bucket.
We'd
Can
be
I
happy to-
have a motion
write that
that we
buckets
do
down.
that?
I'll make the motion.
Second,
I'll second.
Chris, second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Good. That will take care of that. Good.
Got something on the agenda.
Yay. Check. Now, do you want to go back to some of these items that are on this list that are not in section
56.
56?
Well, how about, let's talk about 57.
Oh,
It's on page 3. It's fairly simple. It's the.
page 3.
No, yeah, page 3 of 4, 57. And it deals with, city council may by ordinance or the qualified registered voter of the city by petition signed by 10% of the electors. This is about bringing something forward to a vote under a referendum, I think. And 10%, I think the consensus is that I've heard that we'll be at about 60,000 people in the city at the next census. So to sort of require 6,000 people, signatures to get something on a ballot seems a little bit high to me. If we want citizen participation to get some issues. So I'm just looking to maybe make a change from that 10% down to something more reasonable.
Wait, is this a ballot, is this the amount of people you need to have city council vote on something, or is this the number of people to get something on the ballot, so citywide we're
Yes.
voting on?
Something to get on the
I
ballot.
think to get on the ballot, it should be a very high threshold. I mean, I don't want a situation where you end up with any group of, someone goes out in the neighborhood and just finds whoever is willing to sign a petition so that they can get stuff, and we suddenly start having tons of ballot issues coming up that aren't necessarily pertinent to the city.
Is there precedent for the 10% anywhere?
Can I,
Everybody looks at you.
Well, I've looked at this issue before. It's, some places in counties, they set a number, a couple thousand, some they do 5%, some 10%, but it usually tends towards a higher threshold depending on what that process is. So if you collect 10% and then it is automatically put on the agenda for consideration by the council, that's one thing. If it's something that goes to referendum, does it go to referendum with the language on the petition? Because what if, in
it's
our
not
own
legal?
state, something gets reviewed by the Supreme Court to make sure that the ballot language is clear and it's not going to have unintended consequences, or it doesn't violate some other constitutional provision. So I think the question about how high the threshold has to be depends on, is there any safety checks against abuse? And that's really all that I can say. A lot of communities that have low thresholds require the commission to do something, to take the next step with it. So there's an intervening, they can deny it, they can
Council can-
reword it,
For council
but
consideration.
then what's the value?
You want to speak?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, for council consideration, yeah, I'd be all in on having something very low that anybody, any group of people that wants council to consider something. But to the point where we're putting it on the ballot and we're expecting the rest of the taxpayers to actually pay for, and just time and effort of city staff, yeah, I wouldn't want to log down city staff by any group of people that has some idea.
Barbara?
yeah, I want to ask, 10% of what? The census is all the people that are in the town. Isn't this 10% of voters?
It is, 10%
Okay,
of
so,
the
so the census isn't the critical number that we look at. What do we have for number of voters in,
Can you pull up the Lee County website and you can tell them how many Bonita voters there are, probably, if you pull that up now. Lee County SOE.
because I would think the number must be quite a good deal smaller, since so many of the people that live here at the time then they do the census don't actually vote here. They are registered in, I don't know,
That's
Michigan and Missouri and all kinds of places not here, so.
We'll wait a minute until he can pull that up.
There would be some difference, but the census should be based on their permanent residency, proof of this at the time of the day of census.
But doesn't a census also include children? And
It does.
It does, so I mean, it'd be a much higher number than
Right,
the
no,
number of
you're
Your
voters.
existing language talks about electors, though.
Okay, well, and also, do you,
Mhm.
Arlene, have you looked at any of the other comparable city? I mean, is this 10%, is this like a standard around the state? Or is this kind of, do we pull this out of a hat? Because we've done that in Bonita. I'm not gonna say we've never done that in Bonita. So I'm just curious if there's anything behind that. And if it's general, then I'm okay with it, I think. But if it's
I
something
think
we
we can
pulled out of a
review
hat.
the
we
other
should look at it.
local charters and see where it falls in, but I would imagine this probably followed a trend at that time.
I think it did. At the time it was put in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at a couple right now.
We, or they took a lot of language from the other charters. When they did it, they looked at other places.
Well, I mean, it makes sense, and if it seems like it's something that is standard around the entire state, I mean, why recreate the wheel, in my opinion, but I'm only one vote.
There's I'm not finding it in Naples, so I got Naples up right now.
It's just we need the number of Venetians voting.
Registered to vote, anyway. Not a lot of them don't vote. but-
Yeah. And for statistics. Okay, hold on.
I mean, while we're waiting,
Yeah.
I'll mention, I don't think I share Omar's concerns. I understand the concept here that as the community gets bigger, you get to a point where you really do need to consider bringing that down, but I'd like to hear what the number is, because I think, you know, it's a reasonable issue to address, but we may not be quite at that point yet where the numbers are so big that we really need to consider dropping the percentage.
Can't you just go on Google and say how many voters are there?
Well,
in the
because
city?
they had a recent election, their election statistics are only showing Fort Myers Beach right now. I'm trying to find the last election
Well, why
results.
don't we defer this?
We'll
and then-
defer
Yeah, we'll
this
get that.
until he finds it. Let's,
I was trying to find
yeah.
something easy.
you were looking for something easy. Now, could you
try
look for
something else.
something else?
Yeah.
And so Arlene was just
Oh.
asking me, she's, the current language states that it goes to council. Well, it does, but the way it's written, it's 10% puts an item on for the election.
It does.
It doesn't say the petition language carries over completely. What it says is that the council, they may submit it to the council to put on the election. The council will set up the language by ordinance. But then you get into the situation, well, how much change, how much latitude does the council have? I would say it's unclear as if they have to do it. I believe the language indicates that they have the chance, and I'll read it out loud. City council may, by ordinance, or the qualified registered voters of the city may, by petition, 10% of the electors registered to vote in the last general election, submit to the electors of the city a proposed amendment to any or all part of this charter. The form, content, certification of any petition to amend shall be established by ordinance. So that's just for ordinances, to the amending the charter. Initiative and referendum, which is section 54, the powers of initiative and referendum are hereby reserved to the qualified registered voters of the city. Other than that, it lays it to the state law on how to set up recall elections, all those things. It doesn't give any additional guidance in here. So we can maybe provide you the initiative and referendum provisions from state law to give you some guidance, but there's nothing else in the charter that gives any clarity on that issue.
John?
I don't really read that to include that interim step, giving our council discretion. At
No,
least that's my.
it just says ordinance. It doesn't say, it said it'll be set up by ordinance, but if the council sets an ordinance up that says the process is, you take the petition, we revise it to make it legally sufficient, well, who defines how that's legally sufficient? Well, and there's another
How
part
do
of
you
this, I
show you
believe,
do the
I believe
intent?
the other process is, well, how do we guarantee that the petition, let's say that there's a petition and the first 300 signatures saw had nothing on it. Do you believe that Bonita should have term limits of only one term? Okay? And then the next 750 signatories, they actually had some language. And then the next 2,000, they actually had a different language. Or which version at the end when they have
You'd
the
have to have it all the
10%?
same, or you wouldn't count it. I mean, it seems to me that would be a way to not approve the number of signatures right on its face. But I think the other question you're asking is, if they do the first one, should we have a limit to one term? Then that isn't the sort of thing you can send to the voters without putting it into legal language.
Oh, yeah.
Should we do this? I think you have that power to do that, to put it in legal language here and in the state law. But I don't think you have the power, or the council has the power to say, if you get your 10%, we're not going to put it on the ballot. Because it says may or may, and each side of that may has the right to do this. So I don't see how you could interpret it any other way than that.
We'll let you interpret it.
All right, I know we don't have an ordinance that's codified. Now, whether we adopted an ordinance in some past process, I'll go and look and
All
see.
right, fine. Next,
29.
29.
It's on page 2. It has to do with
Page 2,
digital formatting.
digital formatting of notices, right? Okay.
Still showing as open.
I thought we answered this.
I beg your pardon?
I thought we resolved this one.
I did too, but it's just showing up here as being on the continued list. I thought, if I remember right, what you said was we're sort of stuck with the process.
Yeah, they're
as it is.
statutory processes. The only,
So we could
So
say
let's
this one's
mark that.
Okay.
Eliminated.
And then, I don't know if 29C, the next one, where it says that the ordinances are effective 30 days after that date, after the
killed that
date of
one, too.
passage and so forth. You know, we wondered why that was
right.
like
So
it
long.
was, and did it make any sense? And
I don't think
So
we've
that-
gotten to the bottom of that one. I think
you
we
never
were,
got to the bottom of that?
no, I think we were holding at a recommendation to remove it, but we never we never went back and looked at
Could
the
you, say?
minutes.
I'm sorry, I
I'm sorry.
can't hear you.
We were sort of holding on a recommendation to remove it, but we wanted to go back and see what the minutes said from that meeting. So I think, I haven't looked at those minutes. So we'll try and find out that rationale,
Okay.
bring that back to you.
All right,
So we will move the options, the section 29 discussion to complete then, but leave 29C until the attorney can come back with.
okay.
What is it that you're going to come back with? Just what we talked about previously?
No, not your minutes, the minutes from the charter review that
Charter
added
review.
that. That was in addition to the original
Okay.
charter. Why they thought they
Why they
needed that
did
30
it.
days.
All right. Are there any others that you want to discuss right now? Let's see, I think we've covered everything but this list, so, I mean, we still have time if we could go over some of the things that are on this list.
Oh, Madam Chair, 21C,
21, can you tell me what page?
page 2, the fourth item down. This was the item that was just a confusion over the 180-day wording. In
You rewrote that.
21C.
Right.
I see that as just a technical issue,
Yes.
and I think that, I think we understand what it's intended to do. If my suggestion is if the city attorney thinks there's a better way of saying it in the charter, we consider that. And I'm amenable to that, but otherwise,
We should
if we
just
don't,
forget it.
then let's move on.
Yes. Are you there or not?
Yeah, no, I know I've presented draft language
I was
on
gonna say, you
this.
did it, you gave us.
I didn't see
Have
the
draft
checklist
language?
until today, so I didn't know if we,
Isn't that what,
Do you want to bring back the?
and he's crossed out stuff and done it, didn't
yeah,
And
no, I have a strike through.
Does
underline.
anyone have the
It's okay.
draft
he? Yeah, I do,
language
it's
with
right
them?
here. You may have it.
John, is that the draft language?
Yes, I think
Could
so.
you give us a hint?
Why don't you just read it to them or something?
Well, there's a good bit crossed out and several new sections included, so I'm not sure if it addressed just the 180 days or not, but basically, the last sentence that was added reads, "If the vacancy occurs within 180 days of a general election, then no special election shall be called, and the seat shall remain vacant until filled upon the outcome of the general election."
This was the language regarding what happens if a council person's gone. We voted on approving the issue of how to deal with the mayor and the deputy mayor.
Yeah.
That we wouldn't
You
hold
made it
it.
much clearer. with
Yeah,
this language.
I
It's
think
much better.
I think we're done on this. This is just the remaining 180 days, and I think that language does clarify it.
Does that have to go to the people?
Well,
Well, then,
I-
can we have a motion to accept this language?
I would make that motion.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So
Opposed?
Do you want?
Thank
want
you.
this so know
we
did
will
it?
move this to complete with the adoption of the new language,
The adoption
of the new language.
of his language, yes. All right,
I'm sorry, who motioned?
I'm sorry,
Who motioned it? Oh, John, and then who seconded?
Chris,
Chris.
all right. Anyone else have something that they put in that they would like to discuss at this point?
I'll just say that I think on number 15B, the spending limits, I gave a discussion, and I think we moved on the Citizens United discussion, but we're still leaving the open issue of should there be new limits. So that's where the handout I gave out today with the other. So I think that should maybe, we could reword that to say, should we adopt changes to the campaign contribution limits? It's not really a discussion about Citizens United anymore. It's whether or not we're going to change the language.
Right, yeah, but didn't the discussion end with you deferring to what was already law?
Well, I think everyone wanted to see other examples. So no one has an example like ours, where we calculate the number
Right.
of people and the percentage. So I provide you with some of our neighbors'
Right.
done, and I think that's just whether you guys want to move forward with that or keep the system we have in place.
Was it a nice blend, or was it, or comparable, our neighbors, Lee County specifically? would be-
They're all flat numbers. So they're all everyone locally is 1,000. Once you move outside of Lee County, it starts to vary a little bit, but it seems that each community stays close to whatever its
Right.
current cap is.
There's another one here that we might look at.
Barbara?
It's number 47.
And what page?
It's page 2 of 4 of the list of them,
Okay.
and it's on page 29 of the thing. And this was the question of whether we wanted to increase this from 3 years to 5 years. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't remember why we wanted to do that. But I mean, maybe that's something we could address, and it's
Not-
the lapse of appropriations is the issue.
Capital expenditure appropriate.
Yep, right. Yep.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
before we get off this spending cap issue, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
um,
Thought we were all-
I mean, there was a suggestion made that, that maybe we need the input from the folks who've run for office and how that's affected them. And so maybe to keep that one moving, we ought to put it in the bucket for discussion with city council if we haven't already done that. I understand the issue. It seems pretty clear what that most of the other communities follow the statutory section, and I don't have a good feel for whether that's something that people here would like to see happen or not, but that seems to me one way to get some feedback on that.
Good.
You know,
Yes,
Madam Chair,
Omar?
Another thing, actually, is there any way that you guys can look up not just money raised, but money used, and see if we can see over the last few cycles, how often do candidates actually use the full amount? So if people aren't even using the current full amount, then it doesn't seem like raising it would be very beneficial. But if people are, everybody's using the full amount, then we can look at obviously increasing that if they think that that's an issue.
I think there's a final campaign report that I think shows the complete ins and outs, but I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, that'd
See
be
if-
great.
Good. Good.
Honestly, the argument, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
I was just gonna say, honestly, I mean, the only argument that I've heard against it, and I mean, I give credence to it. I mean, I think that the more granular we get into these contributions on a local level, I feel like we're treading on First Amendment violations, and that could open us up from a liability standpoint. So I would just caution us against getting too granular on this, because really and truly, if somebody decided to
Tell
challenge.
me what granular is.
When you're gonna dictate somebody's can only spend $1,000 or I'm sorry, $250 or whatever, that you saw the examples of the other municipalities who are doing that. I'm saying by putting ourselves in that situation, we're putting ourselves in a position where we're now literally going against constitutional rights in regards to free speech, and we shouldn't put ourselves in that box. That's my caution on it. Because there's no amount. That's what the entire federal case was about.
Yeah, but
Chris?
I think you advised when we talked about this a few months ago, that Citizens United applies only to federal elections,
Right.
Right.
that it doesn't apply to state elections, so
That's
I'm not so concerned about that.
No. Now, where are we?
I had
That's the million-dollar
suggested that if
question.
we're trying to get things that we can
Yes.
resolve, there's this section 47 that's on page 2 of 4, and it deals with lapse of appropriations on capital projects, which now say that if it isn't spent within 3 years, it will be deemed abandoned and will no longer be able to be used. There was a suggestion that increased to 5 years. I don't know who suggested it, that seems like something we could
Discuss,
discuss and determine whether to keep or throw out.
yes, we'll discuss that with
I
the
have nothing to
council.
say, I'm just bringing it up. Uniquely as that might be.
We'll discuss that with the council.
By the way, whoever brought that up, was there, just so that we're aware, because I have no idea what the benefit or negative
I
is.
don't either.
What was the
Wait,
theory? What was
I
the
didn't write
reason?
it, so
Oh.
I was
And I did research, I know I presented a little bit at one of the meetings. I couldn't find any basis for it either.
Okay.
I couldn't really find any other, maybe one or two other, in fact, I know Estero had it, but they were only copying Bonita, so it was the only basis for it. I found, because you can also search through, search nationally, and I did find some other states where there's some municipal charters had it, but it was not something that seemed to be called for either by Florida law or any particular reason. I think maybe, in that sense, I might have even suggested the 5-year, only because our capital improvement plan runs on a 5-year
right.
clip. So 3 years is sort of shortchanging ourselves, even if we are leaving this language in. So I don't see any reason to keep it. I don't know what it does.
Is there any reason we can't just eliminate it?
We could just eliminate it. We could recommend its elimination.
Because in essence, the city council reviews the charter, reviews the budget every single year, and we provide an updated capital improvements plan for them every year, and we provide them with the history of the background of the expenditures in those reports. I'm not sure where the link, I do have notes that it must have come from one of our individual meetings, because it's in my notated here. What you may want to consider is, now that we're looking at much large-scale projects such as the quadrant plan, which is the intersection of Bonita Beach Road and 41, as we work towards our trail plans, our multi-use paths that sometimes require acquisition and of properties and multiple grants. Some of these projects are planned, and we start working the engineering, but it does actually get us to the step of construction, could well be, a 3-year.
Could we
planning.
vote to eliminate that provision?
Yes?
Yes.
I would make that motion.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Madam-
Second.
I mean,
Discussion. John?
thank you. So I'd like to understand exactly what we're eliminating here. Is it the second sentence in section 47? Is it or is it come after the semicolon in the second sentence? Just what are we? The purpose of any such appropriation shall be deemed abandoned if 3 years pass. That seems like the relevant
That's
section.
important.
That's it.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so after the
Put
semicolon.
a period after repealed.
Well, there you go. You said it better than I did. Thank you.
Well, let me ask you a question. The first sentence lists every appropriation, except for an appropriation for capital expenditure, shall lapse at the close of the fiscal year. So is there any purpose for keeping that?
Right.
I would think that happens anyway, but,
It does.
I mean, don't you just
I mean,
appropriate
I don't know
for
that there's any
years?
use for anything in chapter 47. I don't know that it
Do
does
we have
any
the slightest
value.
clue why this is in here? I mean, what it's trying to, what problem it is attempting to solve?
The only thing that I could imagine is that it was possibly intended as some kind of anti-dilution clause for borrowing capacity. To say that you're basically not going to, you're going to keep your funding appropriate for these sources. But when the city or any municipality goes out and they issue large-scale bonds, there's usually covenants to bonds an appropriate amount for the repayment of those bonds, and there are anti-dilution clauses that
Yeah.
are part of those contracts. I don't know that this does anything other than that. I can't think of any reason why. I think we discussed the possibility that maybe someone put something on as a nice-to-have project, and it just stays on year after year, but people may believe mistakenly that it's going to get approved. I don't know how to deal with the concern that there may be a perceived funded project that's not going to be funded. I think we have enough actual projects that we'd like to see appropriations made for that will take multiple years to get the money on.
Can I just ask you a question about the process of that? If you had a long-term project that you didn't get to for years and years and years, would you encumber money in the budget so that it couldn't be used for something else? And that's what this is trying to stop? I mean, it's the only thing I can think of is you couldn't set aside, like in a reserve fund or something, money to do something and not ever use it, because that doesn't allow you to use it for the things that need to be done now. But to me, it doesn't make any sense.
I suppose you could do that.
Any evidence we've done that?
No.
Seems like a solution in search of a problem to me.
And one of the reasons I would suggest that wouldn't happen is because we have new projects that come up, and so every year we're evaluating where we are in the capital improvements plan and where the priorities are.
Yeah.
So if a line item is continually not funded, if it's not a reason because of permitting or Army Corps,
Yeah.
other things out of the control, then it might be a change in the policy, which would mean that money would be redesignated.
In your opinion, Derek, is this duplicative and unnecessary language altogether?
Well, it's nothing in state statute. So if it was something that was required by state law, I haven't been able to find it, either in Department of Revenue's law library or anywhere else. Now, I have seen it, as I said, in charters elsewhere in Florida, but not very many places. And I've seen it elsewhere in other state constitutions and things like that, but I haven't gone and researched why any of them put it in. I could do that, but I suspect that the answers are going to be very specific to those instances and not to us.
So was the motion to delete the entire section? Okay, and if staff feels that we don't need it, I would agree, although I will mention that further to Barbara's point, this seems like one we may need to do a little explaining, just because it seems like it impacts the city's finances in some ways, and people may question that.
Okay.
I think, Arlene, you can include an asterisk. Here was the intent of what was going on, and they're going to read the notes anyways. But and make sure they know that. That is important. I think you're very spot on with that.
Can I have a motion? I have a motion and a second. Can I have a vote? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Well, I think the main thing now is that you pull together the sections for the Code of Ethics, put those in one group, and then we can vote on the other things as they come. Is there any further business?
Move to adjourn?
Wait, wait a minute.
I did.
Second. All those in
Wait,
favor,
sorry.
aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Whoops.
Sorry, we just had one other agenda item. I just wanted
Oh,
to kind
I'm
of, so
sorry.
we don't have to make a decision today, but I wanted to begin the discussion.
Oh, the date.
Actually, I wanted to talk about the public meetings you would have, and we've included
Oh,
the
okay.
the original resolution of the committee. And on page 3 of 4 of that resolution, we highlighted in yellow where it talks about the
Yeah.
Charter Review Committee shall hold at least 2 public hearings at intervals not less than 10 days apart. I do know typically in the past, these have been closer when you had language. The committee had discussed the possibility of getting more public input, and we're wondering if you would like staff to schedule an
Yeah.
open house or a public meeting where prior to these two meetings referenced in here would be working towards your end language and notifying the public of your language. But were you wanting a meeting where the public could interact with you earlier in the process to get feedback?
I honestly think that you're not going to get that. I think that's wasting your time and ours.
And they can come here.
And, because I really do. I think it's a waste of your time. I'm sorry to say that, but no one has come in the times that we've had meetings.
Sure.
And so I think the 2 public hearings will be fine.
We just wanted to clarify because it was brought up about.
No, that's right.
And so we'll then work towards these 2 public meetings would be towards the end of the process, so.
Correct. And we might want to try to get an idea when people are going to be, what you're thinking of and what other people might be away or anything, so that we can all be here for those.
Apropos of that point, I'd just like to let you know that I will not be here for the May meeting, and so Russ, you might want to come sit.
Well,
It is,
and then
I'm going to be out of town for my
Chris
mom's
will
birthday.
not be here for the May meeting.
When is, that's May?
Second,
It would be the next meeting is May 13th at 4 PM.
May
Oh,
13th.
the second
Yep.
week. Yeah, then I probably won't be there.
you don't think you'll be here?
I have to check, but right now it's looking like that week I'll be in China.
If you wanted, you can adjust you can
One's
vote
gonna
to
be in
adjust.
Africa,
gonna be in
one's gonna be in
Washington, D.C.
China,
I'm gonna be in Washington.
one's in
I'm
DC.
just going to be at my mother's 100th birthday, but I'm
Yeah,
not going to miss it.
We'll all come to that.
You can come to that.
No, you must
Go
miss
for-
that birthday to come here.
But, I'm happy to reschedule if you
I
want
don't
to
know
pick another date.
how many
if you
times
need.
I can divide myself.
Let's see, we can put a third of you in each chair.
Maybe Robert will show up.
You're gonna be the most valuable member of the board, Russ.
Wait,
Come
actually,
on.
so can we see if
All
maybe
right.
we can reschedule May's meeting?
Yeah, I think maybe you could see what you have on your schedule
Okay.
and see if we couldn't.
Circle back
We
with
we
us.
can circulate an email, and then you can respond
Yeah,
individually
yeah.
on
Okay.
dates.
That'd be good.
I could
That'd
come
be
the
good.
Tuesday, the Monday before that.
Yeah, I could.
The
Mon-
following,
Or
too.
the,
Are you all
yeah, the
available?
Monday after that I could come
6
to.
or 20.
But I couldn't
Yeah, I
come
could do
after
both.
that, I'm out of town.
Well,
again,
let's
so-
do it by email
Yeah.
We'll
without
throw out-
everybody
Yeah.
discussing their calendar. And we need a date for the meeting with the council.
Council.
So if the council would give us a few dates,
I-
we would be glad to look at those and see what we could do.
Okay, we will bring that up at the next council meeting to
Yeah,
ask them to
because
provide some
they
dates.
have more than we do. Adjourned.